All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to this Spring Boot in Action talk. My name is Stéphane Nicoll. I'm a committer on the core framework container, and I'm also a Spring Boot committer. You are welcome to tweet during the talk. Please note down the tag, so the Spring Boot tag. We have a lot to cover in only 30 minutes. So that will be my last slide. So what I want to show you is basically two things because of the lack of time. The first thing I want to show you is how Spring Boot can help you to get started very easily and very quickly. And we'll do a small application. We'll build a small application together. And once we've done that, I would like to show you the second thing, which is the non-functional requirements, non-functional features that you get with Spring Boot. So if you want to start, if you want to build a new app, you may go to this website, start.spring.io. And I'm going to choose DevOps here. You can use the kind of build that you want. You can use Maven or Gradle, depending on what you use. You can choose the kind of packaging you want for your app, the Java versions you want. By the way, while I'm that, you probably heard at some point that Spring 4 has an excellent support for Java 8. That does not mean that you need Java 8 to run a Spring 4 or a Spring Boot application. It will run just fine as from Java 6. So I'm stick with Java 7. I'm going to just keep the default. And once you've done those, once you've defined those metadata for your new project, you can choose technologies, basically. So what I'm going to do, I'm going just to select web and generate a project. And open that project in my IDE. We're not going to look at the build file for now. We'll go back on that later. What I want to show you is what you get with this small tool. So you'll get an application that's empty, really. There is 3 annotations on them. The first 2, you probably know them already. The first one is to enable that class so that you can annotate methods on them, annotate bean methods on them, so that you can create extra beans. So that's basically saying that this class is a configuration class. Component scan is going to pick any class in that demo package or any sub packages. So that's regular Spring, nothing new here. And the last one, enable auto configuration, is new, and that's basically going to transform that class into a Spring Boot application. And what that's going to do is Spring Boot is going to inspect the class path of your application. So the dependencies that you've added, it will inspect your configuration and figure out what it has to configure for you. So it's really about convention over configuration. So since I decided to create a web app, you could build a command line app or a daemon app or whatever with Boot. I'm going to create a basic controller. I'll make it a little bit harder than the regular one you see. No. And I'm going to map that to the root of my application. So I'm going to inject I'm going to choose a property for that conference because I'm going to use that later. And I'm going to default that to Devox. All right, so let's start this small app then. As you can see, there is nothing fancy. It's a main class. There is no VM arguments or program arguments or whatever. It's really right-click and run. And we have an app. Okay. So what happened really is, if you look at the build file, If you look at the build file, there's only one dependency. The other one is for test, as you can see. It has the scope test on it. So the only dependency that we have is something called a Spring Boot Starter Web. And what Boot provides, it provides those starter, which will bring, so these are the thing you saw on the right, on the web page. And what that's going to do basically is it's going to pull the dependencies that we think are the good ones to fulfill a certain use case. So if you take the starter web to build a basic web application, that will bring a Spring MVC, that will bring the GSR 303 validation, and it will bring a container, and in this case it will bring Tomcat. So the application starts. Boot is looking at your class path, figure out that there are things it can configure, and namely it can configure a container for you, it can configure Spring MVC, and it can deploy the simple controller that I've created. So I want to show you how you can basically use that application outside of the IDE. And for that, I'm just going to build it on the command line. As you can see, there is a plugin here, a Spring Boot plugin. So if I look at the result of the build, there's two files. There's the original jar, which is the regular jar you would build without boot. And there is a slightly larger jar, which is actually your application. So if I'm doing this, I'm basically starting the app. So boot creates auto-executable jar application. So my application is still here. Because of that model, we also need a really rich configuration framework to be able to configure items very easily, to be able to override them and specify values in many ways. So if for instance, I'm running the app with this flag, I'm going to basically provide a value for the hello.target property. So you can use that infrastructure for your own keys. Spring Boot provides also a lot of keys, so all the auto configuration that Boot provides can be further customized if the default that are provided does not really fit with what you have. And we also build all kinds of features. So for instance, this application properties that's empty here, it's going to be picked up by default. If you put that file in the working directory, so in the directory where you start the application, it will also be picked up. And you can specify a property on the command line using system properties or even environment properties if you want. And there is a ton of other options that you can use. What I'm going to do now is to basically implement something in that application and add a starter. That will be better. So as you can see, all the starter starts with spring-boot-starter. So I'm going to choose MongoDB. And I'm going to create really a simple domain class, which has an ID, a username, a first name and a last name, so really nothing really fancy about it, but that's not really important because what I want to show you is the configuration, not the complexity of the model. So I'm going to create a repository for that. So a CRUD repository for user and the primary key string. And a couple of search methods. That's going to use Spring Data. So Spring Data is going to implement a proxy implementation for that interface, and it will derive the proper query based on the method signature. Come on. I'm going to create a test for that. An integration test, really. I'm going to inject my repository. cleaning stuff. Oh, that's repository, not user. All right, and creating a simple user and basically making sure that all that works as it should. So saving a new user. I'm going for Dave Sire, which is one of the co-lead of boot. And, oh, maybe I should have shown that. I will do that in a minute. So where is this username is coming from? Nothing really fancy about it. It's simply built from the username and first name and last name that you provide. Okay, maybe I should start Mongo, that would be nice. And run that. Okay. So, like the first starter, it brought, you wanted to build a web application, so what the starter brought is a set of dependencies, the minimal dependencies to fulfill that use case. By adding Spring Boot Starter data MongoDB, that's going to bring Spring Data MongoDB, so the MongoDB specific implementation and support for Spring Data, and the Mongo driver. And when the application will start up, it will realize that those are available in the class path, and it will provide auto-configuration for that. So that's going to scan the repositories, since my class here ends with repository and is within the package that is being scanned. It will be picked up by default, and a repository implementation will be generated. And since there is no Mongo connection defined in this application, it will basically try to configure to connect to the default Mongo, which is the Mongo on that machine on the default port. So if you install Mongo on your machine and you use that, it will connect by default to it. If that's not what you want, so if Mongo is on a separate server or you've installed that on a different port or whatever, there are properties that you can use to tune the way the auto-configuration works. So you can still benefit from the auto-configuration, even, of course, if your use case is slightly different. The next thing I want to do is to expose that repository as a REST endpoint, and I'm going to add a starter for that. And I'm going to tune a bit just to show you the URI of that particular search methods. If you don't do anything, it's exposed with the name of the method. Okay, I need to map the parameters to be able to specify them. And let's start our application again. By default, it's the repository is going to be exposed at the root of your app. You can change that, of course. And it will use the name of the repository without the repository suffix, and it will put the S with it. Oh, what? Oh, I have probably two apps running at the same time. Here we go. Okay, I have nothing because my store is empty, but I have those links that have been generated, one in this case, to the search part of that repository. And there I can find my two search methods, and I can use that. Obviously, it won't return anything, so I've prepared a few scripts here. Since those REST endpoints actually expose CRUD operations by default, so if you post a JSON document, for instance, on that URL, it will create a new instance for me. So I'm going to create 3 entries. So that's basically the result that I get. So 201 created with the location of the created object that I have here. And I can also, for the fun of it, search it like I did in my test. That's not Spring Boot specific, of course. This is Spring Data REST. So if you have a Spring application, you can also use those features, but you have to configure them. What I want to show you is how Boot will back off if you define something in your configuration. So if you have an opinion about something, if you define something, if you configure something, Spring Boot will also realize that and not auto-configure that part of your application. So the next logical step is to add security into the mix, and as you may guess, there's a starter for that. I'm just going to restart the app with no change, except the dependency. What I get is Spring Security is on the class path. There is no specific configuration. So we're going to secure all endpoints with a user, which is called user, and a password that we don't provide. We don't provide a default password. We don't want to be responsible to have a boot app in production with a password that's written in documentation in case you forgot to change that, and that happens. So we auto-generate one every time you start the app. But that's not what you want, right? You don't want to do that. So what we'll do is we'll configure security instead, and Spring Boot will simply back off. So I'm not going to do anything fancy here. I'm just going to create a simple in-memory authentication manager with a stupid hero user. I'm going to give it some roles and flag that as config, of course, and restart my app. And I'm logged in. And if you look at the logs, here, there is no default password being generated for that, because we don't need to, since you provided an opinion about it. So that's the kind of getting started experience you get with Boot. You choose a technology. It will auto-configure something that's sensitive. You can start using it. And if you want to go into more detail, you can look at the documentation. So for instance, Spring Data REST has tons of options. There is also annotations you can put on your repository interface to tune the way the endpoint is exposed, the kind of operations that are exposed, etc., etc. So there you can dig into the documentation of that specific project to learn more about it. But at least, if you don't know anything and you want to just look at it, you can start very easily with Boot, and Boot will help you along the way. So that's for the productivity. Notice also that there is no build script involved or whatever. You stay in your IDE. You run application as a simple main class. What we often get as a question is, how do I set the remote debugger on the application? And we ask, have you tried to just debug simply by right-clicking the main class in your IDE? And people tend to forget about that, because that's so easy that they configure the Maven plugin or the Gradle plugin to do it. So what I want to show you now is the things that are a bit unrelated to that, and the kind of non-functional features you can get if you have a Boot app. And for that, I'm going to add an extra dependency, which is called the actuator. The actuator will basically bring all those features I'm talking about. Maybe I need to restart. So these are mostly monitoring and management features that you need in any application and that you have to redo over and over again. So for instance, there is an endpoint to get environment about the project, so the kind of properties, the keys that are available, the keys that have been set. And I get an access is denied because that's an administrative feature. We don't want to expose that to any authenticated user. So by default, we require a certain role to be set on the user, which is admin, as you may guess. and I took hero here on purpose. So I could go ahead and modify that config and give the role to that user, but I'm not going to do that. Instead, I'm going to tune the way the auto configuration works, and I'm going to say management.security.role equals 0, which is basically changing the default value. So that works. And I get system properties, environment properties, the profiles that are active if you want to figure out what those are. And also all the configuration properties that you've defined. So in this case, I have an application.properties at the root of the class path, and these are the keys that are defined in it. It's a REST endpoint, so you can also track a specific property if you want to. There's also an info endpoint where you would define the name of the application, the version of the application, some build information like build date or whatever you may have in mind. It's empty by default because we have no idea what those information can be. If you put keys that starts with info in your property file, those will be picked up by default. So info.version, for instance, will output a version in that JSON document. There is also some nice utilities to get information about your application. For instance, the last few requests with the header information. If your application does not behave like it should, you can create a thread dump remotely. That's quite handy. You can also get the beans of your application. So the beans that are defined, and more importantly, the location where the bean has been defined. So if you have, and complex applications do use that feature, if you have multiple sources for a particular bean, so a bean with a given ID that's defined multiple times, and your application does not seem to behave like it should, you can look at that endpoint to figure out from which resource that bean was loaded. So as you may have understood by now, what's happening when a boot application starts is all the auto configuration that are defined are called one by one, and we check if that auto configuration should apply or not based on conditions. Mostly, is a certain class available in the class path? So if you want to auto configure for JMS, for instance, it will first check if javax.jms.message is in the class path. If it's not, there's no reason to go further. But there's also a condition like conditional on missing bean. So if a bean is not defined, then that means that maybe boot can auto-configure that for you. You can get a report of what was enabled and what was disabled with some details on the command line if you run with the debug flag or if you enable debug logging. You can also look at this endpoint to get more information. So for instance, we have a support for crash. You probably know about that. So it's a remote shell. You can basically SSH in your app and run command on it. The crash auto configuration did not apply because one class was not in the class path. So crash is obviously not here, so we're not going to do anything. You can get also your MVC mappings. So basically, which action will be invoked based on a version of a URI. We have a metrics framework also. So we define basically two concepts, counter and gauge. Counter allows you to increment or decrement a value, and gauge records a single value. We use the first to count the number of times a given endpoint has been invoked with the HTTP status code. And we use the gauge to record the last execution time, basically. So you can add your own very easily. For instance, star.spring.io, which is a boot app, has those metrics also. There are additional metrics that have been defined. So you can get basically a view of which starter is used the most. If you want to understand, if you want to know more about that, the initializer is an open source application also. So you can go on GitHub spring-io/initializer, and you can find the code there. Finally, there is also a health endpoint. So basically checking if your app is okay. And every time you invoke that endpoint, we will check, in this case, if Mongo is available. So it is. And what I'm going to do next is to build a custom one. So let's go. I'm going to create an Earth indicator. I'm going to call Devox Earth indicator. Yeah. I'm going to say the app is up and some funky detail, whatever. So that method is, every time you invoke the Earth endpoint, that method will be invoked. And here, of course, you're probably going to inject a remote service or a data store or whatever and check it's up. And if you do that, it's picked up automatically for you. All right, I have 4 minutes for questions. And I can't see you, so if you have a question, maybe move a bit more. Yeah.
I think you said the repository was picked up by its name.
Yes.
So is component scan also scanning class names and not annotations?
So the question is, the user repository has been picked up by component scan. Are we also scanning class names on top of annotations? So the answer is the component scan feature. You can basically register handlers on it, and the basic ones you probably know is classes that are not annotated with add component or add service will be created as Spring Bean. In Spring Data, they have an additional handler that's basically looking at the name of the class and also the interface that it extends from. So if you have a user repository that does not extend from a Spring Data repository, nothing will happen, of course. Yeah, sorry, yeah.
So if you disregard the seamless integration with the remaining Spring frameworks, in your opinion, why should I go for Spring Boot instead of just going along with Drop Wizard?
Go along with what? Sorry.
Going along with Drop Wizard. What's your main
I would say drop wizard is probably. Sorry.
What's the question?
Oh, sorry. So the question is, in your opinion, why should I go with drop wizard versus going with Spring Boot? It's a good question actually. It really depends the use case that you want to use, the kind of technology you integrate with. If you're using Spring already, and you have a good experience with some portfolio, some Spring modules, you should definitely go with Spring Boot, because these are where there you'll find the best auto-configuration facilities. If you're using Drop Wizard and you find it great and you have no problem with it, I would say stick with it. And if there is something in Drop Wizard that we don't support, maybe you should create an issue and we can have a look to that. Yes.
An example of how the health indicator behaves when there is an exception, when it's down.
Could I provide an example of when the application is down?
Yeah.
Right now, you mean? Yeah, I can do, probably, if I do this. You have to wait for 10 seconds that Mongo said is gone. That's what you get. Yes? Yeah, so that's a good question. So do we support, can you deploy a Spring Boot application in a regular container? And the answer is yes. So when I was on start.spring.io, I could have chosen WAR there. And when you do that, it's going to basically build a WAR file that you can deploy on any Servlet 3.0 plus container. Okay, time is up. Thank you.